The shotgun blast echoed through the saloon like a crack of thunder, sending glass and whiskey spraying in a deadly shower as Winifred Thornton dove behind an overturned table. She hadn't expected to find trouble in Silver Creek, but trouble had certainly found her. The year was 1875, and Winifred was running out of places to hide. "You can't escape me, Winnie." The voice belonged to Raymond Dawson, her former employer and the man who'd sworn to make her his wife by any means necessary. "I own half the territory. There's nowhere you can go that I won't find you." Winifred's heart hammered against her ribs as she scrambled toward the back door, her reticule clutched tight against her chest. Inside was everything she had left in the world, $43.16, a silver locket containing a portrait of her late mother, and a train ticket. The precious ticket represented her last hope, passage on tomorrow morning's eastbound train to St. Louis, far from Raymond's reach. Another shot splintered the doorframe inches from her face. Winifred stifled a scream and burst into the alley behind the saloon, her boots slipping in the mud as she ran blindly into the gathering dusk. Silver Creek was supposed to have been safe a place to catch her breath before continuing east. Now it was just another town she needed to escape. The sky opened up, rain pelting down in sheets that plastered her calico dress to her skin. Winifred ducked between buildings, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The train station loomed ahead, its lanterns casting weak halos through the downpour. If she could just hide there until morning. Her foot caught on something, a loose board, a stone, and she pitched forward, landing hard on her hands and knees. Pain shot through her wrists, but worse was the sickening splash as her reticule landed in a puddle. Winifred lunged for it, fingers scrabbling desperately in the mud, but the damage was done. The ticket was soaked, the ink bleeding into an illegible smear. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No!" Winifred clutched the ruined ticket to her chest, tears mixing with the rain on her face. Without that ticket, she was trapped. "Need some help, madam?" The voice came from the shadows beside the station, deep and unhurried. Winifred startled, nearly falling again as she scrambled backward. A man stepped into the light, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face partly hidden beneath the brim of a worn Stetson. A duster hung from his frame, and beneath it, she caught the glint of a star pinned to his vest. "I'm not," she began, but faltered when she heard shouting from the direction of the saloon. Raymond's men were organizing a search. The stranger followed her gaze, his expression hardening. Without a word, he reached down and offered her his hand. Winifred hesitated only a moment before taking it, allowing him to pull her to her feet. "Train's not coming till morning," he said quietly, leading her toward the platform. "And you look like you could use somewhere dry to wait." "My ticket," Winifred said, voice breaking as she held up the sodden paper. "It's ruined." The man barely glanced at it. "That's the least of your worries right now, I reckon." He guided her to a door at the side of the station, unlocking it with a key from his pocket. "Station master's an old friend. We can wait in here." Inside was a small office with a desk, a pot-bellied stove, and not much else. The stranger struck a match, lighting a lamp on the desk before stoking the stove to life. Winifred stood dripping on the threshold, suddenly conscious of her bedraggled appearance. "You got a name?" the man asked, shrugging out of his duster and hanging it on a peg. Winifred Thornton," she paused. "And you are Alexander Reid." He turned to face her, and in the lamplight, she could finally see him clearly. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with sharp blue eyes and a strong jaw darkened by stubble. The badge on his chest identified him as the town marshal. "Now, Miss Thornton, why don't you tell me who's chasing you?" Winifred sank into the chair he offered, exhaustion finally catching up to her. "Raymond Dawson. I worked as a governess for his children after his wife passed. He took an interest in me," her voice hardened. "An unwelcome one." Alexander's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew colder. "Dawson, cattle baron from up north," Winifred nodded. "He's powerful, connected, When I refused his advances, he threatened to ruin me, claimed I'd stolen from him, that I was morally corrupted. No one would take my word over his. She stared down at her mud-stained hands. I've been running for 3 months. I thought if I could get back east. You'd be safe, Alexander finished. He crossed his arms, leaning against the desk. What you need ain't distance, Miss Thornton. What you need is justice. Winifred gave a bitter laugh. Justice? For a woman with no family, no money, against a man like Dawson, there's no such thing in these territories. Alexander's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Now that sounds like a challenge. Before Winifred could respond, voices sounded outside, men calling to each other, boots squelching in the mud. Alexander moved to the window, carefully peering through the gap in the curtains. Dawson's men, Winifred whispered, rising to her feet. Alexander nodded, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Stay here, don't make a sound. He slipped out the door, leaving Winifred alone with her pounding heart. Through the thin walls, she could hear the conversation outside. Evening, gentlemen. Something I can help you with. Alexander's voice was casual, but with an edge of authority that made Winifred shiver. Looking for a woman, came the reply, a voice she recognized as belonging to Dawson's foreman, Harlan. Brown hair, blue dress. Seen anyone like that? Can't say I have. Town's pretty quiet tonight on account of the weather. Mind if we check the station? She bought a ticket east. There was a pause. Station's closed till morning. Even if she was planning to leave, the train won't be here till 8. The conversation continued, Alexander's replies becoming increasingly clipped. Winifred pressed herself against the wall, praying they wouldn't search the building. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the voices receded. Alexander returned, water dripping from his hat. They're heading to check the hotel and boarding houses. We don't have much time. What do we do? Winifred asked, wringing her hands. Alexander considered her for a long moment. You said you need to get east. Why? I have a cousin in Philadelphia. She's offered me a place to stay until I can find work. And if you don't make it east, what then? Winifred faltered. I don't know, keep running, I suppose, until my money runs out. Alexander nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. I've got another idea. But you'll have to trust me. I don't even know you, Winifred protested. No, he agreed. But right now, I'm the only chance you've got. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the rising moon. Alexander led Winifred through back alleys, avoiding the main thoroughfare where Dawson's men were still searching. They reached a modest house on the edge of town, its windows dark. My place, Alexander explained, unlocking the door and ushering her inside. Not much, but it's dry. It was indeed modest, a main room with a kitchen area and small table, a few chairs by the fireplace, and doors leading to what Winifred assumed were a bedroom and washroom. But it was clean and orderly, with books stacked on shelves and a quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair. You'll be safe here tonight, Alexander said, lighting a lamp. Tomorrow, we'll figure out our next move. Our? Winifred asked, raising an eyebrow. Alexander met her gaze steadily. Dawson's been using his money and influence to run roughshod over folks around here for too long. If he's added intimidating women to his list of sins, well, that's where I draw the line. You don't even know me, Winifred repeated, softer this time. I know enough. Alexander gestured to a door. Bedroom's yours, I'll take the chair. I couldn't possibly. You can and you will. His tone brooked no argument. There's a clean shirt you can use as a nightgown in the dresser. Try to get some sleep, Miss Thornton. Tomorrow's likely to be eventful. Winifred nodded, suddenly too exhausted to protest further. She paused at the bedroom door. Thank you, Marshal Reid. Alexander, he corrected. And you're welcome, Winifred. Alone in the small bedroom, Winifred changed out of her damp clothes into the offered shirt, which hung nearly to her knees. She combed out her tangled hair with her fingers, wishing for a proper brush, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. The events of the day swirled in her mind: the confrontation at the saloon, the ruined ticket, meeting Alexander. Why was he helping her? Men, in Winifred's experience, rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. Yet there had been no suggestion of impropriety in Alexander's manner. Just calm competence and an unexpected kindness that made her chest ache with something dangerously like hope. Despite her racing thoughts, exhaustion soon claimed her, and Winifred fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to sunlight streaming through curtains and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, Winifred didn't remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back: the chase, the ruined ticket, Alexander. Voices murmured in the next room. Winifred froze, straining to listen. Alexander was speaking to someone, his tone low and serious. Another man answered, older, from the sound of his voice. Winifred dressed quickly in her now dry clothes, smoothing her hair as best she could before opening the door a crack to peer out. Alexander stood by the fireplace, talking with an older man in a worn suit. Both turned at the sound of the door. "Ah, Miss Thornton," Alexander said. "Hope we didn't wake you. This is Judge Isaac Monroe." The older man inclined his head politely. "Miss Thornton, Marshal Reid has been telling me about your situation." Winifred stepped fully into the room, her gaze darting between the two men. "Has he?" "The judge is an old friend," Alexander explained, "and no friend of Raymond Dawson's." "Indeed not," Judge Monroe agreed, his face hardening. "Dawson's been buying influence throughout the territory, but he hasn't managed to buy me, and I've been looking for a way to check his power for some time." "How does my situation help with that?" Winifred asked cautiously. Judge Monroe smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Your testimony about his behavior, coupled with what I suspect we'll find if we look into his business practices more closely, could be exactly what we need." "You want me to testify against him?" Winifred's voice rose in alarm. "He'll kill me before I ever reach a courtroom?" "Not if you're under my protection," Alexander said firmly. "No disrespect intended, Marshal, but you're one man. Dawson has dozens at his command." Alexander and the judge exchanged a look that Winifred couldn't quite interpret. "We have a proposition for you, Miss Thornton," Judge Monroe said. "One that would keep you safe while we build our case against Dawson." "What kind of proposition?" Alexander cleared his throat. "Marriage." Winifred stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "Not a real marriage," Alexander hastened to add, a flush creeping up his neck. "Just on paper. As my wife, you'd be under my legal protection. Dawson couldn't touch you without bringing the full force of the law down on himself." "And," Judge Monroe added, "it would give us time to gather evidence against him while keeping you safe." Winifred sank into a chair, mind reeling. "You're suggesting I enter a false marriage with a man I met less than a day ago?" "I know it's not ideal," Alexander admitted, "but it would just be temporary. Once Dawson is dealt with, we could quietly arrange an annulment." "Why would you do this for me?" Winifred asked, looking up at Alexander. "You're risking your reputation, your position, because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because sometimes the law needs a little help to work the way it should." Judge Monroe cleared his throat. "I should mention, Miss Thornton, that Dawson and his men are still in town. They've offered a reward for information on your whereabouts. It's only a matter of time before someone talks." Winifred closed her eyes, weighing her options. She could try to run again, but how far would she get with no ticket and Dawson's men watching the station? She could hide, but for how long? Or she could accept this strange proposal and hope these men were as honorable as they seemed. "If I agree," she said slowly, opening her eyes to look at Alexander, "what exactly would this entail?" "You'd stay here," he answered. "We'd be seen together in town occasionally, enough to establish the story that we married quickly after a whirlwind courtship. Meanwhile, Judge Monroe would gather evidence against Dawson, and once we have enough, we bring charges." "And how long would this charade need to last?" The men exchanged another glance. "A few weeks," Judge Monroe said. "A month at most. A month of living under the same roof as this stranger, a month of pretending to be his wife. It was madness, And yet, what choice did she have? Very well, Winifred said, squaring her shoulders. I accept your proposition. The wedding took place that very afternoon in Judge Monroe's parlor, with only his wife as witness. The ceremony was brief, the words familiar yet strange in this context. When Alexander slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, belonged to my mother, he explained quietly. Winifred felt a peculiar twist in her chest. I now pronounce you man and wife, Judge Monroe concluded. May God bless this union, Mrs. Monroe insisted on serving them tea and cake afterward, chattering about how romantic it all was, how she'd always said Alexander needed a wife. Winifred smiled and nodded, playing along while feeling increasingly overwhelmed by the enormity of what she'd just done. We should get back, Alexander said eventually, standing and offering Winifred his arm. Thank you for everything, Judge Mrs. Monroe. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down on the dusty street. Alexander led Winifred toward the center of town rather than back to his house. Where are we going? She asked, uncomfortably aware of curious glances from passers-by. General store, he replied. If we're going to sell this story, you'll need some things of your own. The next hour passed in a blur as Alexander purchased clothes, toiletries, and household items on Winifred's behalf, ignoring her protests about the cost. The storekeeper's wife was beside herself with excitement about the marshal's sudden marriage, promising to spread the happy news. That's the idea, Alexander murmured to Winifred as they left the store, arms laden with packages. By sundown, everyone in Silver Creek will know we're married. Including Dawson's men, Winifred pointed out, especially them. Alexander's expression was grimly satisfied. Now let's go home, wife. The word sent an unexpected shiver down Winifred's spine. Back at Alexander's house, their house now, she supposed Winifred unpacked her new belongings while Alexander prepared a simple supper. The domesticity of it all was surreal after months of running. What happens now? She asked as they sat at the small table, eating beans and cornbread. We wait, Alexander said. Judge Monroe will start his investigation. Meanwhile, we act like newlyweds and keep our ears open for news of Dawson's movements. And where will you sleep? The question had been weighing on her mind. Alexander gestured to a bedroll by the fireplace. I've slept in worse places. I can't take your bed. You already have, he pointed out with a hint of a smile, and you will continue to do so. I'm not much for social niceties, Winifred, but I do know that much about being a gentleman. Something in his tone brooked no argument, so Winifred simply nodded. Thank you. Later, after washing the dishes together in companionable silence, they sat by the fire. Alexander whittled a piece of wood, while Winifred darned a sock she'd found with a hole in it, falling easily into the rhythms of shared space. Tell me about yourself, Winifred said eventually. If we're to convince people we fell in love quickly enough to marry, I should at least know something about my husband. Alexander looked up from his whittling, the firelight playing across his features. Not much to tell. Born in Kentucky. Father was a farmer, mother died when I was young. Came west after the war looking for something new. Ended up with a badge instead. You fought in the war, he nodded, his expression closing slightly. Union, cavalry, 4 years that felt like 40. Winifred recognized the shadow that crossed his face, the same one she'd seen in so many men who'd returned from that terrible conflict. My brother fought too, she said softly. He didn't come home. Alexander's gaze softened. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Winifred set aside her darning. What made you become a lawman? Seemed like a job where I could do some good, he shrugged. World's got enough people looking out for themselves. Figured someone ought to look out for others. Like me? Winifred asked, a smile playing at her lips. Alexander's eyes met hers across the small space between them. Like you, he agreed, his voice low. Something warm unfurled in Winifred's chest, and she quickly looked away, flustered by the intensity of his gaze. Well, she said, standing, I should turn in. Thank you again for everything. Good night, Winifred, Alexander said, returning to his whittling. In the bedroom, Winifred changed into her new nightgown, marveling at how quickly her life had transformed. Yesterday, she'd been running for her life, certain her last hope had been destroyed with that train ticket. Today, she was married if only on paper and safer than she'd felt in months. Alexander Reid was unlike any man she'd ever known. His quiet strength, his unwavering sense of right and wrong, his willingness to help a stranger at potential cost to himself, all of it spoke to a character rarely found in the harsh world of the frontier. Winifred touched the gold band on her finger, turning it thoughtfully. This marriage might be a sham, but the protection it offered was real. For that, she owed Alexander more than she could express. With that thought, she slipped into bed, listening to the soft sounds of Alexander moving about in the other room until sleep claimed her once more. The next morning established what would become their routine. Alexander rose early, made coffee, and was often out of the house on his rounds before Winifred woke. She would tidy the small house, prepare meals, and occasionally venture into town for supplies, always aware of curious eyes watching the marshal's new bride. Word had indeed spread quickly about their marriage. Wherever Winifred went, she was met with congratulations and curious questions about their whirlwind romance. It was so unexpected, she would say, the story they'd crafted coming more easily with each telling. We met when I arrived on the stage, and it was as if we'd known each other our whole lives. Most seemed to accept the tale, though Winifred detected skepticism from some of the town's matrons. A marshal marrying a stranger with no family or connections was unusual enough to raise eyebrows. But Alexander's standing in the community was such that few questioned it openly. More concerning were the men who lingered at the edges of town Dawson's hired guns, watching and waiting. They made no move against Winifred directly, but their presence was a constant reminder of the danger that still lurked. 3 days after their wedding, Alexander returned home with a grim expression. Dawson himself arrived in town this afternoon, he said without preamble. He's staying at the hotel. Winifred froze in the act of stirring a pot of stew. Did he speak to you? Not yet, but he will. Alexander hung his hat on a peg by the door. Judge Monroe thinks we should attend the social at the church tomorrow night. Show ourselves as a happy couple. Make it clear to everyone, including Dawson, that you're under my protection now. The thought of facing Raymond Dawson made Winifred's stomach clench with fear, but she nodded resolutely. I'll be ready. The church social was the biggest event in Silver Creek's calendar, a monthly gathering where the entire town came together for food, music, and community. Winifred spent the day preparing, washing her hair and pressing her best dress, a new blue calico purchased during their shopping trip. When she emerged from the bedroom that evening, Alexander was waiting by the door in his best clothes, his badge polished to a shine. He stared at her for a long moment before speaking. You look beautiful, he said simply. Winifred felt her cheeks warm at the sincerity in his voice. Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself. Alexander offered his arm, and she took it, acutely aware of the solid strength beneath her fingers. In the days they'd spent together, Winifred had grown increasingly conscious of Alexander as a man his quiet competence. The subtle kindness he showed not just to her, but to everyone he encountered. The rare smile that transformed his serious face into something that made her heart beat faster. It was a dangerous awareness, she knew. This marriage was temporary, a means to an end. Developing genuine feelings would only lead to heartache when it was over. The church was already crowded when they arrived, lanterns casting a warm glow over tables laden with food. Conversation dimmed briefly as they entered, curious eyes taking in the newlyweds, before rising again in a buzz of speculation. Marshal Reid, Mrs. Reid. The preacher's wife hurried over, beaming. We're so delighted you could join us. Everyone's been talking about your marriage, such a romantic story. Alexander's hand found the small of Winifred's back, a gesture that appeared affectionate but which she recognized as protective when his eyes scanned the room. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. We wouldn't have missed it." They circulated through the gathering, accepting congratulations and making small talk. Winifred found herself falling naturally into the role of devoted wife, touching Alexander's arm when she laughed at his rare jokes, leaning into him when they stood talking with others. For his part, Alexander played the besotted husband convincingly, his eyes rarely leaving her face, his hand always finding some way to maintain contact with her. It was during a lull in the music, as they stood by the punch bowl, that Winifred felt a chill run down her spine. She turned to find Raymond Dawson watching them from across the room, his cold eyes fixed on her face. "Alexander," she whispered, her hand tightening on his arm. "I see him," Alexander murmured, straightening to his full height. "Stay close to me." Dawson approached with the confidence of a man used to controlling every room he entered. He was expensively dressed, his silver hair and beard immaculately groomed, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Marshal Reid," he said, extending his hand. "Raymond Dawson." "I don't believe we've had the pleasure." Alexander shook the offered hand, his expression neutral. "Mr. Dawson, what brings you to Silver Creek?" "Business, primarily, though I admit I was surprised to hear about your recent marriage." Dawson turned his attention to Winifred, who fought the urge to shrink back from his gaze. "Mrs. Reid, you look familiar." "I don't believe we've met," Winifred replied, amazed at how steady her voice sounded. "No," Dawson's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "My mistake." "Congratulations on your marriage. It must have been quite whirlwind." "When you know," Alexander said, his arm sliding around Winifred's waist. "Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Dawson?" Something dangerous flickered in Dawson's eyes. "Indeed. Though in my experience, hasty decisions often lead to regrets." "Not in this case," Winifred said, finding her courage. "Meeting Alexander was the best thing that ever happened to me." Dawson studied her for a long moment before inclining his head. "How fortunate for you both." "If you'll excuse me, I see Judge Monroe over there, an old acquaintance." As Dawson walked away, Winifred released a shaky breath. "He knows," she whispered. "Of course he knows," Alexander replied quietly, "but he can't prove anything, and he can't touch you now without making himself look guilty." "He'll find another way," Winifred insisted. "You don't know him like I do." Alexander's arm tightened around her waist. "Then we'll be ready." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of tension. Winifred was acutely aware of Dawson's presence as he circulated through the gathering, charming the townsfolk with his easy manner and open wallet. By the time they left, her nerves were stretched to breaking point. The night air was cool as they walked home, the stars bright overhead. Alexander kept Winifred close to his side, alert for any sign of danger, but the streets were quiet, the town settling down for the night. "You did well," Alexander said as they reached the house. "Dawson was watching for any sign that our marriage isn't genuine." "It wasn't difficult to appear devoted to you," Winifred admitted, then felt her cheeks flush at how the words sounded. "I mean, you've done so much for me. The gratitude is real, even if the marriage isn't." Alexander paused in the act of unlocking the door, his eyes finding hers in the darkness. "Is that all it is? Gratitude?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications Winifred wasn't ready to face. "What else would it be?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, Alexander looked as if he might say more. Then he shook his head slightly and pushed open the door. "Nothing. Forget I asked." Inside, the house felt smaller than before, charged with an awareness that hadn't been there earlier. Winifred busied herself with removing her shawl and gloves, hyperconscious of Alexander moving around the small space. "I think I'll turn in," she said, needing to escape the sudden tension between them. "It's been a long evening," Alexander nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. "Good night, Winifred." In the privacy of the bedroom, Winifred pressed her hands to her heated cheeks. What had just happened? More importantly, what was happening to her? This arrangement with Alexander was meant to be practical, temporary. Yet somewhere along the way, her feelings had become decidedly impractical. The way he looked at her, the gentle touch of his hand at her waist, the quiet strength he emanated, all of it affected her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Worse, she'd begun to imagine what it might be like if their marriage was real. If the tenderness he showed her wasn't an act for the townspeople, but a genuine expression of affection. Foolish thoughts. Winifred chided herself as she changed for bed. Alexander was a good man who'd offered her protection when she needed it most. Nothing more. Once Dawson was dealt with, they would go their separate ways, just as planned. So why did that thought now fill her with such inexplicable sadness? The following week brought an uneasy calm. Dawson remained in town, conducting business and ingratiating himself with Silver Creek's prominent citizens. His men were a constant presence, watching the marshal's house from a distance, but making no overt moves. Judge Monroe visited regularly, bringing news of his investigation. Dawson's business dealings are even murkier than I suspected, he told them during one such visit. I've found evidence of land swindles, cattle rustling, even witness intimidation, but I need more time to build a solid case. Time is something we might not have, Alexander replied, pacing the small room. Dawson's getting impatient, I can feel it. Perhaps I should leave, Winifred suggested, not for the first time. Draw him away from town. Absolutely not, Alexander said firmly. We stick to the plan. But as days stretched into weeks, the strain began to tell on all of them. Winifred felt like a bird in a gilded cage, safer than she'd been in months, yet still trapped. Alexander grew increasingly vigilant, his face lined with worry. And Dawson continued his campaign to win over the town, his smile never reaching his cold eyes. The breaking point came on a bright Tuesday morning. Winifred was hanging laundry in the small yard behind the house when she heard approaching hoofbeats. She turned to see Dawson himself riding toward her, alone for once, his expensive stallion a stark contrast to the modest surroundings. Winifred froze, the damp shirt in her hands forgotten as Dawson dismounted and approached the fence. "Mrs. Reid," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Or should I say, Miss Thornton, I must admit you've led me on quite a chase." "I don't know what you're talking about," Winifred replied, backing toward the house. "My name is Winifred Reid." Dawson's smile was cold, a convenient fiction. "Tell me, does your husband know about the silver candlesticks you stole from my home, or the money from my safe?" "I stole nothing," Winifred protested, anger momentarily overcoming her fear. "You know that's a lie. It's my word against yours." Dawson stepped closer to the fence. "And out here, my word carries considerable weight, as does mine." Alexander's voice came from the side of the house as he stepped into view, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. "You're trespassing, Dawson." Dawson turned, his smile never faltering. "Marshal Reid. Just having a friendly chat with your lovely wife. She doesn't seem to be enjoying the conversation." Alexander moved to stand beside Winifred, his solid presence calming her racing heart. "I suggest you leave, of course." Dawson mounted his horse with practiced ease. "But this isn't over. You've both interfered in my business for the last time." He tipped his hat mockingly. "Good day." As Dawson rode away, Winifred sagged against Alexander, her legs suddenly weak. "He's going to do something," she whispered. "I can see it in his eyes." Alexander's arm came around her shoulders, steadying her. "Let him try." That night, as they sat by the fire after supper, Alexander broke the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Tell me about the candlesticks," he said. Winifred looked up from her mending, surprised. "What?" "Dawson accused you of stealing silver candlesticks. Was there any truth to it?" "No," Winifred said firmly. "After I refused his proposal, he began claiming I'd stolen various items, the candlesticks, money, jewelry. It was his way of discrediting me, ensuring no one would believe anything I said against him." Alexander nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." He hesitated, then added, "You know I believe you, don't you?" The simple statement, uttered with such certainty, made Winifred's throat tight with emotion. "Yes," she managed. "I know." "Good." Alexander rose, moving to the window to peer through the curtains at the darkened street. "Because I need you to know that, no matter what happens." "What do you mean?" Winifred set aside her mending, suddenly alert. "Has something happened?" Alexander turned to face her, his expression grave. "Judge Monroe sent word this afternoon. Dawson's men have been asking questions about you in town, offering money for information. And there's talk that Dawson himself is planning to leave soon, possibly tomorrow. If he leaves, isn't that good news?" Winifred asked, though she already knew the answer. "Not if he's planning to take you with him." Alexander crossed to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Winifred, I think we need to move you somewhere safer until the judge completes his investigation." "Where?" Winifred asked, her mind racing. "If Dawson is watching the house, I have a friend with a ranch about 20 miles north," Alexander said. "It's remote, well defended. Dawson wouldn't think to look for you there. But our plan, the marriage, has served its purpose. It bought us time, but now we need to adapt." Alexander's thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "I won't risk your safety any longer." Winifred studied his face, noting the determination in his eyes, the tense set of his jaw. "You're worried," she observed. "Yes," he admitted. "Dawson is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." Winifred took a deep breath, making her decision. "I'll go, but promise me you'll be careful." "If anything happened to you because of me, nothing's going to happen to me," Alexander assured her, rising to his feet. "We'll leave before dawn. Pack only what you need." That night, Winifred lay awake in bed, listening to Alexander's quiet movements as he prepared for their departure. The thought of leaving Silver Creek, leaving this house that had somehow become home in such a short time, filled her with a strange melancholy. Despite the circumstances, she'd found an unexpected peace here, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since before her father died. And then there was Alexander himself. Over the past weeks, he'd become far more than her protector. He was her confidant, her partner in this strange charade, and increasingly, the person whose good opinion mattered most to her. The thought of being separated from him, even temporarily, made her heart ache in a way she hadn't anticipated. Sometime after midnight, Winifred must have dozed off, for she woke with a start to the sound of breaking glass. She sat up, heart pounding as Alexander burst through the bedroom door. "They're here," he said urgently, already moving to the dresser where he kept a shotgun. "Get dressed, quickly." Winifred scrambled out of bed, pulling on her clothes with trembling hands. "Dawson's men," Alexander nodded grimly, checking the shotgun. "At least 4 of them. They've surrounded the house." Outside, a voice called through the darkness. "Marshal Reid, send out the woman and we'll leave you be." "That's Harlan," Winifred whispered, recognizing Dawson's foreman. "He's dangerous, Alexander." "So am I." Alexander handed Winifred a small derringer. "Take this. Use it if you have to." The weight of the gun was foreign in Winifred's hand, but she nodded, tucking it into her pocket. "What's the plan?" "There's a trapdoor in the kitchen floor," Alexander said, leading her into the main room. "It leads to a root cellar, and there's a tunnel that comes out behind the livery stable. Judge Monroe is waiting there with horses." "You knew this would happen," Winifred realized. Alexander's smile was grim. "I hoped it wouldn't, but I prepared for it anyway." He pulled back a rug to reveal the trapdoor. "Go, I'll hold them off." "I won't leave you to face them alone," Winifred protested. "This isn't a discussion." Alexander's voice softened as he cupped her cheek briefly. "Please, Winifred, I need to know you're safe." The tenderness in his touch made her hesitate, but another crash from outside decided her. Alexander lifted the trapdoor, revealing a narrow ladder descending into darkness. "The tunnel is straight ahead, about 20 yards, he instructed, lighting a small lantern and handing it to her. "Don't stop for anything." Winifred took the lantern, then, on impulse, rose on her toes to press a swift kiss to Alexander's cheek. "Be careful," she whispered. Something flashed in his eyes: surprise, warmth, determination. Go, he urged, helping her onto the ladder. The cellar was damp and close, the air thick with the smell of earth and stored vegetables. Winifred held the lantern high, spotting the low entrance to the tunnel on the far wall. Above her, she heard the trapdoor close, followed by the scrape of furniture being moved across it. Winifred swallowed her fear and started forward, ducking into the narrow tunnel. It was barely tall enough for her to stand upright, the walls close on either side. She moved as quickly as she dared, the lantern casting eerie shadows ahead of her. Behind her, muffled by earth and distance, came the sound of shouting, followed by a gunshot. Winifred froze, every instinct screaming at her to turn back to help Alexander. But she forced herself onward, remembering his plea for her to reach safety. The tunnel seemed endless, the air growing thinner as she progressed. Just as Winifred began to fear she'd taken a wrong turn, the passage widened and sloped upward. Ahead, she could make out what looked like a wooden door. Winifred pushed against it, relief flooding her as it swung open to reveal the starlit sky. She emerged behind the livery stable, exactly as Alexander had said. But instead of Judge Monroe, she found herself face to face with Raymond Dawson. "Miss Thornton," he said, his smile cold in the moonlight. "I've been waiting for you." Winifred stumbled backward, her hand flying to her pocket where the derringer lay, but before she could draw it, rough hands seized her from behind. She struggled, crying out as the lantern fell from her grasp and shattered on the ground. Now, Dawson chided, watching impassively as his men restrained her. "There's no need for dramatics. You're simply coming home where you belong." "This isn't my home," Winifred spat, still fighting against the hands that held her. "And I don't belong to you." Dawson stepped closer, his face hardening. "You belong where I say you belong. Your little game with the marshal ends now. Where is Judge Monroe?" Winifred demanded, looking around frantically for any sign of help. Dawson's laugh was unpleasant. "Detained, I'm afraid. My men can be quite persuasive when necessary." Horror washed over Winifred as she realized the full extent of Dawson's plan. "What have you done to him?" "And Alexander, the marshal is currently occupied with some of my more expendable employees," Dawson said dismissively. "By the time he deals with them, we'll be long gone." He nodded to his men. "Get her in the carriage." Winifred fought with renewed desperation as they dragged her toward a waiting carriage at the end of the alley. "Help!" she screamed, hoping anyone would hear. "Help me!" A hand clamped over her mouth, cutting off her cries. Dawson watched with cold satisfaction as his men bundled her toward the carriage. Then, from the darkness, a voice rang out. "Let her go, Dawson." Everyone froze. Alexander stepped into the dim light, his revolver trained steadily on Dawson. His face was streaked with blood from a cut on his forehead, his clothes disheveled, but his aim didn't waver. "Marshal Reid," Dawson said, his voice betraying only mild surprise. "You're proving quite difficult to kill." "I've heard that before," Alexander replied evenly. "Now tell your men to release my wife." Dawson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "She's not your wife, Marshal. The marriage is a sham, as I'm sure the whole town will be interested to learn." "Release her," Alexander repeated, taking another step forward. The men holding Winifred exchanged uncertain glances. Dawson sighed theatrically. "You're outnumbered, Marshal. Even if you shoot me, my men will kill you both." "Perhaps," Alexander conceded, "but you'll still be dead." Something in his tone, the absolute certainty, the calm readiness to follow through on his threat, made Dawson hesitate. In that moment of uncertainty, Winifred acted. She brought her heel down hard on her captor's foot, simultaneously driving her elbow into his ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench free. "Run, Winifred," Alexander shouted, firing a shot over Dawson's men as they reached for their weapons. Chaos erupted in the narrow alley. Winifred darted toward Alexander, ducking as gunshots rang out around them. He caught her arm, pulling her behind him as he backed toward the main street. "My horse is tied at the hitching post," he said urgently. When I say go, run for it and don't look back. I'm not leaving you, Winifred insisted. Yes, you are. Alexander's eyes never left Dawson and his men, who were regrouping in the shadows. Judge Monroe is at his ranch with the evidence we need. Get to him. Before Winifred could protest further, Dawson's voice cut through the tense silence. This is your last chance, Marshal. Stand aside and let me take what's mine. She was never yours, Alexander replied, his voice hard, and she never will be. Dawson's face contorted with fury. Kill him, he ordered his men. Now. Alexander pushed Winifred toward the street as he fired rapidly, forcing Dawson's men to dive for cover. Winifred ran, heart pounding, the sound of gunfire echoing behind her. She reached the hitching post and scrambled onto Alexander's horse, barely managing to gather the reins before the animal, spooked by the noise, reared and bolted forward. Clinging to the saddle, Winifred looked back to see Alexander backing down the alley, still firing at Dawson's men. Then her view was cut off as the horse rounded a corner, carrying her away from the confrontation. Tears streamed down Winifred's face as she guided the horse toward the edge of town, torn between the desperate need to escape and the equally powerful urge to turn back. Alexander had saved her again, but at what cost? Dawn was breaking by the time Winifred reached Judge Monroe's ranch, the journey taking longer than expected as she'd been forced to detour several times to avoid Dawson's men who were clearly searching for her. The ranch house was a welcome sight, its windows glowing with lamplight in the early morning. Judge Monroe himself came out onto the porch as she approached, his face lined with worry. One arm was in a sling, and a bruise darkened his jaw. Mrs. Reid, he exclaimed as Winifred dismounted stiffly. Thank God you're safe. We feared the worst when my men and I were ambushed on our way to meet you. Alexander, Winifred said, swaying with exhaustion. He stayed behind to fight Dawson's men. I don't know if her voice broke. Judge Monroe helped her into the house, where his wife immediately took charge, settling Winifred in a chair and pressing a cup of hot tea into her trembling hands. Marshal Reid is one of the most capable men I know, the judge assured her, though his expression remained grave. If anyone can handle Dawson and his thugs, it's him. But he was outnumbered, Winifred insisted, and Dawson is ruthless, so we've discovered. Judge Monroe gestured to his injured arm, but I managed to escape with this. He retrieved a leather portfolio from a nearby desk. Evidence of Dawson's crimes: land fraud, extortion, even murder, enough to put him away for good. Winifred stared at the portfolio, understanding dawning. That's why Alexander sent me here. He knew you had what you needed to stop Dawson. Indeed. The judge's expression softened. The marshal's primary concern has always been your safety, Mrs. Reid. Everything else was secondary. The realization made Winifred's heart twist painfully. Alexander had risked everything to protect her, not just because it was his duty, but because he cared. The thought that she might never see him again, never have the chance to tell him how deeply she'd come to care for him in return, was unbearable. We have to help him, she said, setting aside her tea and rising unsteadily to her feet. You need rest, Mrs. Monroe protested gently. What I need is to know Alexander is safe, Winifred countered. Judge, please, you said yourself he was outnumbered. Judge Monroe hesitated, then nodded. I've already sent for the territorial marshal and his deputies. They should arrive by midday. As soon as they're here, we'll return to Silver Creek. It was the best Winifred could hope for, though the wait was agonizing. She paced the ranch house, too anxious to eat or rest despite Mrs. Monroe's gentle urgings. Every sound from outside had her rushing to the window, hoping to see Alexander riding toward them, safe and whole. But when hoofbeats finally approached, just after noon, it wasn't Alexander who appeared, but a group of hard-faced men led by a tall figure wearing a territorial marshal's badge. Marshal Fletcher, Judge Monroe greeted them. Thank you for coming so quickly. Your message suggested urgency, Marshal Fletcher replied, dismounting. His sharp eyes took in the judge's injuries and Winifred's anxious face. "I take it the situation in Silver Creek has deteriorated." As Judge Monroe briefed the territorial marshal on Dawson's crimes and the confrontation in town, Winifred's anxiety mounted. Every minute they delayed was another minute Alexander might be in danger if he was even still alive. Finally, preparations were made to return to town. Despite protests from both marshals, Winifred insisted on accompanying them. "Mrs. Reid," Marshal Fletcher said sternly, "this is likely to be dangerous. We don't know what we'll find in Silver Creek." "Alexander Reid is my husband," Winifred replied, the lie feeling more like truth than ever before. "I'm coming with you." Something in her expression must have convinced him, for the marshal merely nodded and ordered one of his deputies to help her mount up. The ride back to Silver Creek was tense, with Marshal Fletcher and his men alert for any sign of ambush. But they encountered no one on the trail, which Winifred found more unsettling than reassuring. Where were Dawson's men? What had happened in town? As they crested the final hill overlooking Silver Creek, Winifred's heart sank. Smoke rose from several buildings, and even from a distance, she could see people gathered in the main street. "Trouble," Marshal Fletcher muttered, spurring his horse forward. They rode into town to find it in chaos. The jail was a smoldering ruin, and townspeople moved about in agitated groups, talking urgently. At the sight of the territorial marshal and his men, a cheer went up from some quarters. Judge Monroe quickly found the town doctor among the crowd. "What happened here?" he demanded. "War," the doctor replied grimly. "Dawson and his men tried to take over the town after Marshal Reid disappeared. Some of the townsfolk resisted. It got ugly." "And Marshal Reid?" Winifred asked, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "Where is he?" The doctor's expression softened with sympathy. "No one's seen him since the fighting started, madam. Some say he was taken prisoner by Dawson's men. Others. He trailed off, unwilling to voice the alternative." Winifred swayed in her saddle, darkness threatening at the edges of her vision. Alexander couldn't be dead. She refused to believe it. "Where's Dawson now?" Marshal Fletcher asked, his voice hard. "Holed up at the hotel with what's left of his men," the doctor answered. "They've got hostages." The territorial marshal's face hardened. "How many men, how many hostages?" As the men discussed strategy, Winifred slipped from her horse, her mind racing. If Alexander was alive and being held prisoner, he would be with Dawson. And if he wasn't, she couldn't finish the thought. The town's blacksmith approached, his face grim beneath the soot that streaked it. "Mrs. Reid," he said quietly. "I thought you'd want to know I saw them take the marshal into the hotel early this morning. He was hurt, but alive." Hope surged through Winifred so powerfully she nearly staggered. "You're certain it was Alexander?" the blacksmith nodded. "I'm sure of it." They had him at gunpoint, but he was walking under his own power. "Thank you," Winifred whispered, gripping the man's arm in gratitude. She turned to find Judge Monroe watching her, his expression knowing. "He's alive," she said, not bothering to hide the emotion in her voice. "Then we'll get him back," the judge promised. Marshal Fletcher organized his deputies and those townsmen willing to fight. The hotel was surrounded, negotiations attempted. But Dawson remained defiant, threatening to kill the hostages if anyone tried to storm the building. As the standoff stretched into evening, Winifred found herself standing beside Judge Monroe, watching the hotel where Alexander was being held. "This is my fault," she said quietly. "If I hadn't come to Silver Creek, then Dawson would have continued his reign of terror unchecked," the judge interrupted firmly. "And Marshal Reid would never have forgiven himself for not helping you when he had the chance." Winifred turned to look at him, struck by the certainty in his voice. "You speak as if you know him well." "I've known Alexander since he first came west," Judge Monroe replied. "He's a good man, one of the best I've ever known, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." "Our marriage is a sham," Winifred reminded him, though the words felt hollow. "The ceremony may have been, but what's grown between you since?" The judge smiled faintly. I'm an old man, Mrs. Reid. I recognize love when I see it. Before Winifred could respond, a commotion near the hotel drew their attention. Someone was coming out, a woman, stumbling slightly, her hands raised. One of Dawson's hostages, released. As deputies rushed to help the woman to safety, Marshal Fletcher approached her, asking urgent questions. After a moment, he strode over to where Winifred and the judge waited. "Dawson's sent a message," he said grimly. "He wants safe passage out of town. In exchange, he'll release the remaining hostages. And if we refuse," Judge Monroe asked, "he starts shooting them one by one." Marshal Fletcher's gaze shifted to Winifred. Starting with Marshal Reid, Winifred's blood ran cold. "You can't let Dawson escape." "I don't intend to," Fletcher assured her, "but I need time to position my men." "If we can make Dawson believe we're negotiating, let me go," Winifred said suddenly. "Send me in to negotiate." Both men stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Absolutely not," Judge Monroe said firmly. "It's perfect," Winifred insisted. "Dawson wants me, he has all along. If I offer myself in exchange for the hostages, he'll believe it." "And you think we'd let you sacrifice yourself?" Marshal Fletcher asked incredulously. "I'm not suggesting a real exchange," Winifred explained, her mind racing ahead. "Just a distraction. If Dawson is focused on me, he won't be watching for your men." The marshals exchanged a look, considering her proposal. It was desperate, dangerous, and possibly their best chance. "Even if we agreed to this madness," Judge Monroe said, "how would you get close enough to Dawson without being shot by his lookouts?" "I'll walk in the front door," Winifred replied simply. "Unarmed, alone, Dawson won't risk shooting me. I'm what he wants." "It's too dangerous," Marshal Fletcher protested, but with less conviction than before. "More dangerous than doing nothing while Alexander and the others are executed one by one," Winifred countered. "This is my choice. Let me try." In the end, they agreed, though reluctantly. A plan was hastily formed. Winifred would enter the hotel to negotiate while Marshal Fletcher's men positioned themselves for an assault. If she could create enough of a distraction, they might be able to overwhelm Dawson's forces before anyone else was hurt. As dusk fell, Winifred stood before the hotel, her heart hammering in her chest. She wore a simple dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, no weapons visible. Behind her, the town had fallen eerily silent as everyone watched the drama unfold. "Dawson." She called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Raymond Dawson, it's Winifred Thornton. I want to talk." For a long moment, there was no response. Then the hotel doors opened a crack and a voice called out, "Come forward, slowly. Hands where we can see them." Winifred raised her hands and walked toward the hotel, each step requiring all her courage. The doors opened wider as she approached, revealing one of Dawson's men, a revolver pointed at her chest. "I'm here to see Mr. Dawson," she said with a calm she didn't feel. The man grabbed her roughly by the arm, pulling her inside before slamming the doors shut behind her. The hotel lobby was dim, the windows covered, a few lamps casting long shadows. Several frightened-looking townspeople were huddled in one corner, guarded by armed men. And there, seated in an armchair like a king on his throne, was Raymond Dawson. "Miss Thornton," he said, smiling coldly, "how thoughtful of you to join us." "Where is Marshal Reid?" Winifred demanded, scanning the room for any sign of Alexander. Dawson gestured, and two of his men dragged Alexander from a side room. Winifred barely stifled a gasp at the sight of him. His face was bruised, blood matting his hair, but his eyes were alert and filled with horror when he saw her. "Winifred, no," he said hoarsely. "Get out of here." "Touching," Dawson commented, rising from his chair. "Your concern for each other is quite moving. Almost makes me believe your marriage might be genuine after all." "Let the hostages go," Winifred said, forcing herself to look away from Alexander. "Let them go, and I'll come with you willingly." "Winifred," Alexander struggled against the men holding him. "Don't do this." Dawson studied her, suspicion warring with triumph in his eyes. A tempting offer, but why would you suddenly decide to cooperate after all this time? Because I'm tired of running, Winifred replied, the partial truth lending conviction to her words. Tired of people getting hurt because of me. If going with you will end this, then so be it. No, Alexander's voice was anguished. Dawson, whatever you want, take me instead. Let her go. Dawson laughed, genuinely amused. How noble, but I'm afraid Miss Thornton and I have unfinished business. He approached Winifred, reaching out to touch her cheek. She forced herself not to flinch. You've led me on quite a chase, my dear. It's over now, Winifred said softly, acutely aware of the passing minutes. Marshal Fletcher would be moving his men into position. She needed to keep Dawson talking, keep his attention focused on her. I'm here. Indeed you are. Dawson circled her slowly, like a predator savoring the moment before striking. But I find myself curious. Was any of it real? Your marriage to the marshal, Winifred glanced at Alexander, meeting his gaze across the room. In his eyes, she saw not just fear for her safety, but something deeper, more profound. And in that moment, she knew the truth. Yes, she said, not looking away from Alexander. It became real, not on paper perhaps, but in every way that matters. Alexander's expression softened, a world of unspoken feeling passing between them. Even beaten and bound, he looked at her with such tenderness that Winifred's heart ached, Dawson's face darkened with fury. How touching, he spat. But it changes nothing. You're mine, Winifred. You always have been. I've never been yours, Winifred replied, her voice gaining strength. And I never will be. Outside, the first shots rang out, Marshal Fletcher's men making their move. Dawson whirled toward the windows, momentarily distracted. It was the chance Winifred had been waiting for. She lunged forward, pushing Dawson with all her strength. He stumbled off balance as the doors burst open and deputies poured into the lobby. Chaos erupted, gunfire and shouting filling the air as Dawson's men returned fire. Winifred scrambled toward Alexander, desperate to reach him amid the mayhem. One of the men holding him released his grip to draw his weapon, giving Alexander the opening he needed. With a swift, powerful movement, he headbutted the remaining guard, breaking free. Winifred. He shouted, reaching for her through the melee. Their fingers had just touched when a shot rang out, louder than the others somehow. Alexander's eyes widened, and for one terrible moment, Winifred thought he'd been hit. Then she saw Dawson standing behind him, a smoking pistol in his hand, and a look of murderous rage on his face. If I can't have her, neither can you, Dawson snarled, taking aim at Winifred. Alexander moved with the speed of desperation, throwing himself between Winifred and the gun just as Dawson fired again. The impact knocked Alexander backward into Winifred's arms, his weight bearing them both to the floor. Alexander? Winifred cried, cradling him as blood spread across his shirt. No, please, no. More shots rang out, and Dawson fell, Marshal Fletcher standing over him with a grim expression. The remaining gunmen, seeing their leader down, quickly surrendered. But Winifred was aware of none of it, her world narrowed to Alexander's pale face, his labored breathing. Stay with me, she begged, pressing her hand to the wound in his chest. Please, Alexander, don't leave me now. His eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. Winifred, he whispered, what you said, about our marriage becoming real. I meant it, she said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. Every word. I love you, Alexander Reid. Do you hear me? I love you. A faint smile touched his lips. Good, he murmured, because I've loved you since the night I found you in the rain. Then his eyes fluttered closed, his body going limp in her arms. What followed was a blur of shouting, of hands pulling her away as the doctor rushed forward, of being led somewhere quiet to wait while Alexander fought for his life on a makeshift operating table. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Winifred lost all sense of time as she sat vigil, refusing food or rest. Judge Monroe and his wife stayed with her, offering what comfort they could. The townspeople came by with food, with prayers, with gratitude for Alexander's bravery and her own. He saved us all, the blacksmith told her gruffly. We won't forget that. Finally, the doctor emerged, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. Winifred stood, her legs barely supporting her as she searched his expression for news. He's alive, the doctor said, and Winifred nearly collapsed with relief. The bullet missed his heart by less than an inch. He's lost a lot of blood and there's risk of infection, but if he makes it through the night. He'll make it, Winifred said with absolute certainty. He has to. The doctor allowed her into the room where Alexander lay, pale and still beneath clean bandages. Winifred sat beside him, taking his hand in hers, and began her vigil anew. Through that long night, she talked to him about her childhood in Boston, about her dreams for the future, about the life they could build together if only he would fight, would stay with her. And all the while, she held his hand, willing her strength into him. As dawn broke, Alexander's fingers tightened around hers and his eyes opened. "Winifred," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. "I'm here," she said, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "I'm right here." "Dawson, dead," Winifred assured him. "It's over." Alexander's eyes held hers, a question in their depths. "And us?" Winifred leaned forward, pressing her lips gently to his. "We're just beginning," she promised. Recovery was slow. For weeks, Alexander was confined to bed, his strong body rebuilding itself day by day. Winifred never left his side, nursing him with a devotion that became the talk of Silver Creek. Judge Monroe, before returning to the territorial capital, came to see them one last time. "The circuit judge will be through next month," he told them. "If you'd like, he could perform a proper wedding ceremony." Alexander, propped up on pillows, looked to Winifred with a raised eyebrow. "What do you say, Mrs. Reid? Shall we make it official?" Winifred laughed, the sound bright with happiness. "I think we'd better, considering the scandal we've caused already," the judge chuckled. "One more thing before I go." He handed Alexander an envelope. "Your resignation from the marshal's office has been accepted, with the thanks of the territory for your service." Alexander nodded, unsurprised. They had discussed this already, his decision to leave law enforcement, to build a different kind of life. "What will you do now?" Judge Monroe asked, though his knowing smile suggested he already knew the answer. Alexander's hand found Winifred's, their fingers intertwining. "We've bought land about 10 miles west of here. Good water, good grazing, thought we might try ranching." "A fine choice," the judge approved. "The territory needs more honest ranchers to balance out the Dawsons of the world." After he'd gone, Winifred sat on the edge of the bed, her hand still in Alexander's. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "Giving up your badge, starting over?" "Never been more sure of anything," Alexander replied, drawing her closer. "Except you." The wedding took place on a bright autumn day, with the whole town turning out to celebrate. This time, when Winifred spoke her vows, there was no pretense, no fear shadowing her joy. Just the simple, profound truth of their love, forged in danger and tempered by sacrifice. "You may kiss the bride," the circuit judge pronounced, and Alexander did, to the cheers and applause of all assembled. At the celebration afterward, Winifred found a moment to slip away to the edge of town, to the train station where her journey in Silver Creek had nearly ended before it began. The eastbound train was just pulling in, passengers disembarking onto the platform. Alexander found her there, watching the train. "Having second thoughts?" he asked lightly, though she caught the hint of genuine concern in his voice. Winifred turned to him, her heart full. "Not one," she assured him, taking his hands in hers. "I was just thinking about how I arrived here believing a train would save me." Alexander smiled, drawing her into his arms. And instead, Winifred rose on her toes to kiss him, pouring all her love into the gesture. "Instead, I found you," she whispered against his lips, "and you said I'd already been saved." "By finding the courage to run in the first place," Alexander said softly. "By fighting for your freedom, you saved yourself, Winifred. I just helped you finish what you started." Winifred laid her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. "Let's go home," she said. Hand in hand, they walked away from the station, away from the life Winifred had once thought she needed. Toward the future they would build together, a future neither of them had imagined when fate and desperation brought them together on a rainy night in Silver Creek. And if, in years to come, their children asked how they met, Winifred would smile and say, "I thought a train ride would save me. Your father said I'd already been saved, and we were both right in different ways." For sometimes, salvation comes not in escape, but in finding the courage to stand and fight. And sometimes it comes in the form of love, unexpected and enduring, strong enough to heal wounds both seen and unseen, to transform a temporary shelter into a permanent home. 30 years later, Alexander and Winifred Reid still lived on their ranch west of Silver Creek. The small homestead had grown into a prosperous operation, with cattle grazing on the rolling hills and orchards heavy with fruit in the summer. Their 3 children were grown now, with families of their own, but they gathered often at the big farmhouse Alexander had built with his own hands. On this particular evening, Winifred sat on the porch, a shawl around her shoulders against the autumn chill, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Gray threaded her once brown hair, and fine lines marked the passage of years on her face. But her eyes were as bright as ever, especially when they rested on Alexander. He joined her now, his tall frame still straight and strong despite the silver in his hair and the old wound that sometimes made him favor his left side in cold weather. Without a word, he settled into the chair beside hers, reaching for her hand with the easy familiarity of decades spent together. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Winifred smiled, squeezing his hand. "I was remembering the day we met, how frightened I was, how certain that my life was over." Alexander's thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "It was just beginning," he corrected softly. "So it was." Winifred leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the quiet companionship they'd built over the years. "Did I ever thank you properly for saving me that night?" Alexander chuckled, the sound warm in the gathering dusk. "Only about 1,000 times. But as I recall, I told you then that you'd already saved yourself." "We saved each other," Winifred murmured, thinking of all they'd weathered together, drought and blizzard, boom years and lean ones, the joys of children and the sorrows of losing beloved friends. Through it all, their love had only deepened, their partnership strengthening with each challenge overcome. From inside the house came the sound of laughter, their eldest daughter, visiting with her husband and children, preparing supper. Soon they would be called in to join the family meal, to share stories and break bread together. But for now, this moment belonged to just the 2 of them. "No regrets?" Alexander asked, a question he still posed occasionally, even after all these years. Winifred turned her face up to his, taking in the beloved features she knew better than her own. "Not one," she assured him, as she always did. "Every step I took, every choice I made led me to you. How could I regret that?" Alexander bent to kiss her, his lips as tender and sure as they had been on their wedding day. When he drew back, his eyes held the same light they always had when they looked at her, a light that spoke of love unwavering, of promises kept, of a journey shared. "I love you, Winifred Reid," he said simply. "And I love you, Alexander Reid," she replied, the words no less heartfelt for having been spoken countless times before. Together they watched as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it as they had faced everything else, side by side, hand in hand, their love a shelter more enduring than any walls of wood or stone. For Winifred had long since learned the truth of what Alexander had told her that rainy night so many years ago. Salvation came not from running away, but from finding where and with whom you truly belonged.